I think it's true of a lot of things of service or trying to stand up for a right cause that, you can incur physical harm or reputational or whatever the forms may be. When you have a deep conviction that something is right, other things kind of fall away because it seems like a kind of rejecting a devil's bargain, an idea of, turning your other way to evil, putting your head down, being silent, or maybe being complicit at various times. But I think part of the power of and the message from both of our faiths and the Judeo-Christian tradition we talk about is that, we believe in one God and we believe in a set of moral laws, and that he's tied our hearts to feel that. And it doesn't mean we're perfect, and it doesn't mean we're entirely evil. We have this mix of, the divine imprint upon us, but also the capacity to do great evil. And it's the daily choice to try to pick between those two things.
Welcome back to Jew and Stew, the podcast. On this show, we feature activists that are on the front lines combating anti-Semitism. Today on the show, we have Isaac Woodward. Isaac grew up a deeply religious Christian family in Georgia. He studied philosophy, political science, and classics at Rutgers University and spent a lot of time studying at the University of Oxford. He now works with Generational Zion, training and mobilizing young Christians to actively support Israel and combat anti-Semitism. He's also very involved in the Conference of Christian Presidents for Israel. Isaac has walked the talk, from serving as a congressional staffer to completing Marine Corps officer training to showing up in the streets with the Chicago Jewish Alliance. During the 2024 Democratic National Convention in Chicago, he and the Generational Zion team linked up with the Chicago Jewish Alliance and marched shoulder to shoulder in a defensive move to actually prevent the Israeli consulate from being attacked by outside agitators during the convention. Isaac is one of those folks who really is doing what he's practicing what he's preaching. And we cannot wait to share this conversation with you all. Isaac, welcome to Jew and Stew. Great to have you here.
Hi, Isaac. Thank you so much for joining us today on Jew and Stew. I feel like this has been a long time coming.
Yes, no, I'm glad to, following up on a connection back in 2024. So excited to be here.
Yeah, I want to talk a little bit about how we first met before we dive into, your history and your childhood and what you're up to now. We connected when you came here during the DNC and walked through Union Park carrying photos of Bonhoeffer, who I will admit I did not know who that was at the time, and then ended up being a very significant because soon after that the Angel Studios movie was coming out, and I actually worked on a panel discussion with the movie producer and with the founder of Angel Studios to really help bring Bonhoeffer's story to life here in Chicago. And I had not known who that was at the time. And you showing up and doing that and marching with in support of Israel and your allies at the time was so profound to me. And I was so impacted by your actions here in Chicago. So, yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, no, it was great to meet you then. Um, so yeah, I'll give a little backstory for people. So affiliated with a few different organizations, and at the time, then the Philos Project had a kind of department or aspect called the Philos Action League, which is now rolled into our group Generation Zion, which I can talk about. And the impetus for that, I think, ties also into the Bonhoeffer story because it reaches back to the White Rose Society, which was a group created by some Christian young professionals in Nazi Germany in the 30s for the purpose of standing up against the Nazification of Germany, the corruptions that they're seeing, and particularly the most malignant twisting of the notion of Christianity or people claiming that mantle to then support anti-Semitism, to support fascism and hatred. And so there's this long lineage that I was raised with knowing about for multiple reasons, which I'll get into in the background. And Bonhoeffer is a good focal point for that. Part of it was interesting too, as you mentioned. He's not super well known. In particular, his face on a picture. So even people that have heard the name, the face isn't very common. So we had these large posters. And I think some people in our group also had some Israeli flags. I'm trying to remember now, but it threw people off a little bit as we walked through trying to see where we were at, and then they saw some of that indication. But yeah, as you mentioned, it was a large, very hostile crowd, and we kind of found a path to cut through and make our stand, and people try to block us. But thankfully it was relatively tame compared to some things I've seen at these.
Well, I mean, I do want to build this picture for people, though. I mean, these were antagonizing groups that were coming during the Democratic National Convention in Chicago, threatening to storm the Israeli consulate. And this wasn't a small group. It was a very, very large contingency. I mean, all of Chicago Police Department was really like on the scene that day, who were incredible. But to see you and your crew show up with those signs, my grandkids will know who stood with us in that moment, and that's how potent it was for us. So I just want to make sure people understand, like, to set the scene, like, we really didn't know what we were walking into. We could have been walking directly into a physical confrontation, directly into harm. And you guys showed up, and that's where I met you guys too. So I do want the viewers and listeners to understand what an incredible sacrifice that was.
I want to point out it was 2 instances. You guys walking through Union Park with the Bonhoeffer where the protests were happening, and then you showing up again with us when we found out that they were trying to storm the Israeli consulate, and we showed up to protect the Israeli consulate and try to like barricade it from being attacked. And your group showed up with us again with the Bonhoeffer signs that evening as well. So it was 2 very iconic moments that I think people who saw those moments, I mean, it went national. Those images went national. People saw them. We had people reaching out to us. Like, I remember asking, who was that group, those Christians who showed up with you from all over.
You were the catalyst. Simona wound up doing a bunch of viewings of the film for our community, all stemming back as you being the catalyst. I mean, it affected us on such a level that we just want you to know we appreciate it so much, and it really is allegoric to the story of Bonheimer. Did I say it right?
Bonhoeffer.
Bonhoeffer.
I always
See,
misspell
I
it,
mean,
even though I've seen it.
but it's a guy who, we always think about as Jews a lot in our grandparents' generation lost their whole family during the Holocaust, and we always think about what would I have done during that time, and what would our allies have done, our friends, the people around us now, what would they have done? And you really, through those 2 events, showed us what you would have done, and we appreciate it so much.
Well, thank you. Yeah, it was a
So thanks, Isaac.
thank you. Yeah, it was an honor, and I know everybody with me in the group feels that it's a weird paradox of, I think it's true of a lot of things of service or trying to stand up for a right cause, that you can incur physical harm or reputational or whatever the forms may be. But I think when you have a deep conviction that something is right, other things kind of fall away, because it's just, in the end, it seems like a kind of rejecting a devil's bargain, an idea of turning your other way to evil, putting your head down, being silent, or maybe being complicit at various times. But I think part of the power of, and the message from both of our faiths and the Judeo-Christian tradition we talk about, is that we believe in one God, and we believe in a set of moral laws, and that He's tied our hearts to feel that. And it doesn't mean we're perfect, and it doesn't mean we're entirely evil. We have this mix of the divine imprint upon us, but also the capacity to do great evil. And it's the daily choice to try to pick between those 2 things. And I think, for many reasons, I think in culture it's getting increasingly clear that the issue of anti-Semitism and all of the evil we're seeing from people on both sides about that is not just about that one issue. It would be worth it to fight it just for that. But as we've seen across so many cultures and times, it's the canary in the coal mine, and it's a rot that, or it's like gangrene that will spread and poison the rest of the host if you don't take it out. So it's not a fun prospect to have to face that, but given the alternative, this is our society, it's our country, our nation, as Christians and Jews and people of different faiths, that consent into this social contract with the notion that we believe in pluralism, religious toleration, civic participation, all these things, as to then see groups take that and try to exploit it, protest, and then basically just turn it into mob riots, particularly whenever the lights go down and it gets dark. And then use threats and intimidation. It's kind of using a wedge of freedoms to try to bring about anti-freedom or tyranny. So
I mean, they've started using Judeo-Christian values as like we are fighting against Judeo-Christian values, and it's mind-blowing because that's what our country is literally founded on. Like, it's not even an attack on us and our religions; it's an attack on Americanism and American life. So it's a very interesting thing to see. I do want to tell
A
you,
brief
you
point
know,
on that, if I can add
yeah,
just a
of
brief
course.
vignette on that, I won't go too long into my professor mode, but we just did a training for about 40 students we brought out that were Christians and Jews at CPAC, specifically on Zionism and on all this content. And the aspect you mentioned there, I think, is so key, particularly for those, I would say, on the right of center that are trying to co-opt this narrative, being anti-Jewish and saying it's somehow in opposition to supporting America. There's a bunch of great work, particularly compiled by the scholar Rabbi Ari Lamb out of New Jersey on the founding fathers specifically and their relations to Judaism, to reading Hebrew, even with some early rabbis. So some of the president of Yale, who then went on to found went on to found Brown. Um, and taught a bunch of the founding fathers at both of those respective institutions, was mentored by a rabbi sent from Hebron in the would have been the late 1600s, and studied Talmud, read all of these various things. And we see this crystallized in the thought of discussions around the Federalist Papers, notes from the Constitutional Conventions and the ratifying conventions, that the founders who went to these mostly colonial colleges, which mandated Greek, Hebrew, and Latin, and people almost always forget the Hebrew, but they were required to take that and be fairly fluent by the end of it. And so the founders self-consciously talked about crafting our republic as a Hebraic model, taking the period between Exodus and Kings, basically, of that kind of giving of the law and a system where people were constrained under an ethical code, but not subject to the whims of, whoever the shaman or the holy man or the king is. And that identity is written about so many times, like it's absurd for people to try to claim it's somehow American to reject Jewish ideas or traditions. And so for those threads, I think in this movement, what we try to do is talk about, rejecting the bad, but also this root of good and virtue that got us to this end result. And any group, left or right, that's trying to claim a mantle of preserving America or improving it or whatever, they have to wrestle with that tradition. And we try to make them rhetorically, self-consciously reject it and say, okay, you want to create a whole new thing. You don't like our country. You don't like our freedoms. You have the freedom to argue for that in the public marketplace, but do not for 1 second claim this authority for tradition that you despise.
Yeah, it's we have the public marketplace, but they're literally trying to dismantle and destroy what we know that space to be and bring that all those systems down, which those are the systems that you are using and they are benefiting you. So it's, the irony of what they're calling for is really mind-boggling to me.
Yeah, in most countries, you can't even have that conversation to begin with, you know? So Isaac, back to, I'm sorry, I kind of derailed us. I'm just curious to where this conviction kind of incubated. You're a Georgia guy. You grew up in Georgia. You probably didn't know too many Jewish people, right? Is
Yeah,
that
no,
safe
not
to
at all.
say? Just give us an idea of young Isaac in Georgia, like coming to terms with this ethos and really seeing the preciousness of it.
Yeah, so I was raised in a conservative Christian household in Western Georgia, right by the Alabama state line, uh, to a homeschool family as well. So it's a cool, you know, group of people that's really spread across the country since I was a kid. I was, growing up in the 90s, and homeschooling was kind of more rare. It's a little more mainstream now, but my mom in particular self-consciously wanted to help craft our education, work with us each individually, and raise us with the system of values. So I credit her a lot for that. For me, it was always intrinsic that that she would talk about history having a narrative, basically, a narrative arc, and not one that's inevitable, but one that does, to paraphrase Martin Luther King, bend towards justice in God's divine plan ultimately, but that to make that happen, there's agency given to us as his children to actually carry that about. So I think that mission was always intrinsic. I also grew up with a deep hatred of any kind of bullying or anything like that, and I think we're fairly insulated. It's a fun thing when you have homeschool families well intact, and we're also mostly boys, so kind of had a pack, and the idea of any kind of mistreatment for people for whatever reason was always deeply distasteful. And then one other element, oh, sorry, I'll add that I think speaks to some of the passion I feel for this. But I think I would have, also been on this side for sure without that. On my mom's side, my maternal grandmother was born in what became East Berlin. It was united at the time because she was born in the 30s, and she was German and a little bit of Polish and a little bit of Ashkenazi Jewish ancestry as well. We think they'd come from Pomerania, what would have been Prussia, around the turn of the 1900s. So she grew up with knowing a little bit of that, but they were totally secular. We don't know when they rejected what, but the Christian side didn't practice Christianity. The Jewish side didn't really know anything about that. They were kind of doing what a lot of people did, especially in those mixed situations of just integrating as Germans, which is something I always talk about of how Jews, when hatred develops, there's no right answer. You can be insular, like the Hasidim, and try to not bother anybody, and they'll find that suspicious and hate you. Or you could be integrated and in culture and politics, and then they'll say you're kind of trying to dominate and control. The same with when Jews at times in the Tsarist Russia were too poor and looked down on, or at times when some German Jews, both in the U.S. and in Europe, rose to economic success, then that was seen as suspect. So anyway, my mom's family there was kind of an example of that. And then when the rise of Nazis came, my grandmother was sent to live with the non-Jewish part of the family, and her parents went into hiding. So they ended up surviving, and I think we lost people on the more extended family side rather than those directly connected. But this gave my grandmother a weird paradoxical existence of being kind of secular, but knowing that tie. And she remembers when the curriculum started to change in school about racial hierarchies, what to look out for in Jews, how they're intrinsically different from us. And she remembers this in her child's mind, kind of trying to process, but like they look the same. Like, I know I have some family there. Basically, at an early age as a kid, she was like, this doesn't really make sense. It seems kind of made up. She was very traumatized, obviously, living during the war. She was in Berlin for the whole time there, and experienced the liberation of the Russians, and had a lot of traumatic experiences from that. And then she met my grandfather, who was an American soldier from Michigan originally, again, kind of like secular. They got trauma bonded and got married, and then he stayed in the army for the next 30, 40 years and was back and forth between the bases in Europe and then also in the United States. So that side of the family got to Georgia through Fort Benning, which is a little bit south of where I grew up. And then in the 70s, my mom's family, through one of my uncles, became Christians, part of a movement called the Charismatic Revival. And it was basically a lot of hippies that had kind of like gone crazy, into drugs, all that stuff. It's crazy. My uncle's experience actually was having an LSD trip where he was living a pretty horrific lifestyle and had an LSD trip going to hell and meeting Satan, basically having Satan say, yeah, I hope you're doing well. Like, we're getting everything ready for you. The water's warm, just we'll see you soon, basically. And that scared him straight, and founded a church and got plugged into that. So then she met my dad at a church in the town where I grew up. So we were raised with like my,
How old was your
yeah,
mom when your uncle had this experience?
I'm trying to think. So she would have been, I think, in her 20s, probably her late 20s. Yeah.
I mean,
So
that's
she,
amazing. He had this very intense experience, and, we can discuss, like, what was in his head versus what was, God speaking to him, or,
mhm.
there's a lot, but, he changed the whole course of your whole family's history and who you are as a person with this.
Acid
Yeah,
trip.
as I, exactly. As I sum it up, often I say like, I exist because of World War II and LSD, essentially because, the union of American soldier, German Jewish
I think most
grandmother,
of us
and
do, though. The Jews do too. My parents were hippies.
yeah,
My grandparents were in the whole, so I could relate.
yeah, and then my mom only met my dad because of being at a specific church, which she wouldn't have been at unless that
Oh,
whole thing
wow.
happened. So yeah,
No, that's awesome.
it's a crazy
Spe-
background, but growing up, I think that also added, and something too, as you mentioned, there's I didn't grow up knowing a single Jewish person in our area. It's far enough out of Atlanta that there's no really connection there. We didn't even know Christians in Atlanta, much less uh, Jewish people there, just because it was kind of rural and isolated. But I always had this interests, reading the Bible, growing up and knowing that tie. So I'd ask my mom questions about, why don't we celebrate Passover or some of these other things, and kind of asking about that transition. And she always found it interesting too, but, was new to all of this stuff. But I think that planted a seed where I wanted to learn more. And then going up to Rutgers University for college, where I was initially in a philosophy program on a track for a PhD.
You met a bunch of Jews there, I'm sure.
I did. Yeah, I did. A lot of amazing Jewish friends, and a big thing too for me was just one day I just walked by the Chabad building and just walked in and found the rabbi and ended up talking to him for like 2 hours and became really close with all of them. I still keep in touch and would go there frequently on Fridays and did Shabbaton experiences. And I would always too be like cautious of, you guys know that I'm, theologically Christian, but is it okay if I hang around and like learn this stuff? And they were just the most kind, generous, wonderful people. It's also what the absurdity of, not to go down this rabbit hole, the absurdity of Tucker Carlson's descent into insanity was going after Chabad randomly. It's like kind of like going after your Mother Teresa if you're trying to attack Catholics. Like anybody who knows anything about it just finds that odd.
Right.
Well, and the level of conspiracy theory is around the poor, like, if you've ever been to a Chabad, they're just like trying to like get people in, like keep their household running.
They're
Like
hustling. They're
I know,
constantly
like
rapping to fill in it.
they don't have time to like plan out these plots you're accusing them of.
Exactly.
But that Chabad gave you an award.
Did it?
That's
Maybe.
what I have.
I know
that,
I did. I was part of
a
their
scholar
Sinai scholars.
fellow.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Yeah, there was a process. So I would say it wasn't just me, but it was a class of maybe 10 of us, 12 of us, something like that. And so it was a scholarship and then opportunities to do Jewish education for, I think it was about a year. Maybe it was my sophomore year. So we'd meet once a week and then also do these trips up for weekends to celebrate Shabbat, which was awesome too. We'd go up to Crown Heights, to Far Rockaway and other places and live with the family for that time. Yeah, so it was really a blessing, and I think helped my education, my understanding, but also just again like the absurdity of all these attacks and conspiracy theories, which I even know people that I grew up with back home that out of not ill will, not out of deep-seated hatred, well, they'll come to me and thankfully they trust me enough to ask some of these questions, and they are not the type inclined to like see Jews as evil or, be racist or anything like that. But all of these narratives are out there. And if people don't actually know Jews and don't know who to ask and hear this stuff from formerly respected commentators, there really has to be an answer to it. And that's where, we can talk about the work later, but the passion I feel is to, fight anti-Semitism, to stand up for the Jewish people, to talk about Israel as a beacon and model of freedom and pluralism in the Middle East, and also to shore up people's understanding of the positive connection that exists. That it's not just like there's this group that's hated and that's bad and let's refute it. But again, talking about the American founding, our alliances now, there's all of these confluence of values that it's not just protecting against evil. It's saying to go wrong in this way is also to like voluntarily like chop off part of the limb of our civilization, part of our roots, and cut off from that. And there's no good that comes from it, and obviously a lot of evil too that comes from it. And also too, I'll say another aspect. Before I came to work in this sector, I was in DC working on other policy areas, including with persecuted Christians. So in the wake of ISIS and their attacks on Christians and Yazidis and Muslims too, in particularly in northern Iraq and Syria, we would take around pastors and other officials that had been persecuted or were kind of under threat of that to talk about the need for this aid bill we were trying to pass, which ended up passing successfully. So I had that connection and knowledge, and then I joined the group I was with at the time, the Fearless Project, and learned about the Jewish connection too, and then went to Israel many times and saw, you, again, those are issues you can't separate out. If you care about Middle Eastern Christians, you can't like dismiss Israel because it's a beacon of actually protecting them, the only community where it's grown since 1948 rather than shrunk, and all these things. And again, I try to emphasize to our students and others we teach is that's not an accident. All these things you keep seeing, it's not like, oh, this, and it's also supportive here. It's because it comes from a common root of values.
Well, and it reminds me of kind of what your grandma was saying about how she started to see the narrative shift. About your grandma talking about how the narrative shift and how people do things evil in a righteous way, meaning like when they're digesting information and not really vetting it or understanding it, and seeing Tucker Carlson, who was on Fox News, and it come more and more into the zeitgeist about certain narratives, then you really don't know the truth. You don't know about the pluralism in Israel. You don't know that Arabs and homosexuals and a lot of these things that people think are illiberal there, who probably would be for those things, don't even know it because they're digesting just wrong information. So it's just so important. So your work, let's talk about specifically about your work in trying to counterweight that. I think it's really important to go to the young children who are on TikTok and digesting these narratives. So what was the inception for you to get involved with the Philos Project and start reaching out specifically to younger folks, younger students too?
Part of it was yeah, I think it was very providential at the time that I found it. It was a good time in my life that I happened to be on the job market. But parallel to my policy work and other things in DC, where I've been since 2014, basically, I had two times where I pursued becoming a reserve officer in the Marine Corps. So I was down at Officer Candidate School in Quantico. And both of those times ended with a broken leg. So in 2016, I broke the left leg. In 2019, I broke my right leg. So that kind of took that off the table for me. But I tie it together because I took some time after that and did rehab for the injuries and kind of tried to think strategically about what my purpose would be, because that had been a passion of mine since I was young. And again, a like missional call, and thought, okay, God, what do you have for me now? What can I really attach to and be useful? And I happened to see the Fearless Project come up and interview at the time when I was looking, and really just gravitated towards it immediately because I saw again that tie of a lot of the things I'd studied in learning about Western civilization, Christianity, Judeo-Christian traditions was kind of bound up in the work that they did, because they worked both with Christians of the Middle East, in Israel, and then in countries where it's more dangerous, and then also the Jewish side and that tradition. Um, and I had a chance to go to Israel. So I was hired on to run our Young Leaders program called the Leadership Institute, and I would select cohorts of two groups of 20 young professionals and go through a curriculum of about 8 to 10 weeks of education via Zoom on content, everything about the region, theology, history, politics, and then conclude with a trip to Israel. And also some years we'd add on aspects about the Abraham Accords and go to the UAE. So that experience was a great opportunity for me to have a mission and a call and get to use some of the education I'd already absorbed and go deeper to transmit it to young people, because I still have that interest in the professor side of some of my time in grad school. And it's been encouraging to see because, as you mentioned, there is just so much misinformation that's come out, and it's gotten a lot worse just since I've been working on this stuff since 2020. Also, that's when the shift happened, maybe 2 years ago or so, that a majority of students would be millennial, which I am, versus Gen Z, and I see a big shift in a lot of their susceptibility to these issues. And I think part of it's understandable because with COVID and other things, there's a big questioning of narratives of authority and all that stuff that's happening, I think, with left-wing young people and right-wing young people. The right-wing side, we tended to work a little more with that, although we did have programs with African Americans and Latinos, but a large base of the support for Israel and Jewish-Christian Alliance has been evangelicals in the US. And that's where we have seen some declines in that. So we were trying to dissect what exactly is happening. And I think it's that skepticism of authority, of received beliefs, also like a hangover era from uh, the Bush years and the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. But it's an interesting paradox too, because for the vast majority of these students now, that's not even a living memory. Like I remember that my first political memory was the Clinton impeachment, saga and all of that, and paid attention throughout. I remember 9/11, of course. But for these, I've almost seen for those that are further from it, they have a more distorted or more negative view, which isn't to say there weren't issues, obviously, with those campaigns, but it's a little confusing because they didn't suffer from it directly, unless they had, you know, mother or father killed in action.
What's the link to what is the actual link to Iraq war and Afghanistan? Is it that Israel, is it the narrative that Israel coerced? Yeah. Okay.
It's two things. It's one, there's this kind of unspoken assumption that anytime we go out of our shores and try to do stuff, we just mess it up. The left believes we do that because we're neocolonial, exploitative, or ignorant. The right believes that because they think, we got caught up in nation building, or it's about corrupt defense contractors that'll just pick any conflict so they can, subsidize themselves and then pay Congress people. Um, so it's kind of a skepticism of anything abroad for some people, and then also there is that distinct narrative of Israel dragging us into wars, which every time I go through that, I try to ask them, what war did they drag us into again? Because there's counters to all of those things. But the biggest one on the Iraq question.
Didn't they abstain from the Iraq war, Israel?
They did. And people conflate a few things that Bibi had some testimony before Congress, maybe a year or two before, where he kind of was pro regime change in Iraq. But he was out of power at the time, and Ariel Sharon was in power when the war happened, and it's documented he actually asked Bush not to go in. Public opinion in Israel was largely against it. I'm sure for a mix of reasons, but one strategic thing would be they saw the possibility that decreasing the power of Iraq, even though it's a malignant force, would empower Iran. So these two hated each other, but they both hate Israel. And if you take out the weaker one, it might be more of a threat. So yeah, all that stuff just crumbles. But there is this perception that Israel has controlled. And then the further down people go from that, they will usually subconsciously start to just mix the term Jew and Israel, or Israeli and Jewish. And I've seen that kind of creep, even in people I know well enough to know they're not trying to let these kind of ideas form, but it's conspiracy theory. And conspiracy theories are so seductive because they take complex events in the world and make a simple narrative with a simple villain, a simple trajectory. And it's just a sorting mechanism for your mind that if you don't know enough, people will default to on all kinds of things. But particularly as I think people in the Judeo-Christian tradition, we have a unique call to rationality, to morality. We believe the universe is logical and can be deciphered. That's why the scientific revolution happened among Jews and Christians rather than among other ethnic groups, because there was a belief rejecting paganism of chaos and the gods fighting each other and everything being subject to whims, to the idea that a rational creator gave a sense of order to nature. And so I try to have people apply that same thing to their own rational thinking and worldviews, and to be skeptical of any kind of cheap explanation that lets them, let themselves off the hook a little bit too. Like they don't have to do harder research. You don't have to work with complex political coalitions. You just know who the bad guy is and who the good guy is.
I actually think that's right on. I think that you default to the boogeyman, because the boogeyman is this nuanced geopolitical thing that you actually have to learn about to understand who was in power, why they wouldn't want to go after more or go after Iraq versus Iran. Yeah. I forgot what question I was going to ask you. Damn it.
Yeah, I can add a little more on the education thing there of just the other thing in particular. I see it's happening on both sides, but I think it's more an issue with young men that I'm seeing, because another aspect of this Gen Z period is they grew up with when the PC narrative and what I grew up under, Obama when I was in college, had kind of faded. And so one good thing about them is I think they started to reject some of the more crazy excesses of the woke movements and those things, because they're open to questioning any narrative. But then they also were sent grasping for some sense of meaning. And a lot of them didn't have a good formation in a biblical worldview, even those that are nominally Christian. And so they will see commentators calling out critiques of the excesses of the woke left and resonate with those critiques, and then just take the rest of what these guys say as gospel. I think the best example is Candace Owens and Nick Fuentes and Tucker, to a lesser extent, where there can be times that they will accurately call out some insanity that the left might be doing, or even in the early days, they'd probably talk about anti-Semitism to the left. But then, just because someone has a critique on one issue that's valid or you're open to, doesn't mean they should be a spokesperson. So we try to go back to the basics of forming, how should you think critically, how should you evaluate these things, and understand that the enemy of your enemy is not always your friend, or you shouldn't import wholesale the ideas that another person might have that you find accurately critiquing your enemies. And the other thing too is, I think I've seen this with Tucker especially, or others, because they got so fed up with being called racist or Nazi or whatever during the Trump era, because I do think some of those languages were were used in excess, they've almost become a parody of what the left called them. So like, yeah, I'm not racist. That's why I'm going to interview a neo-Nazi, and not once mention anything he said at all. And then in the pushback to that, he kind of was like, oh, I get called a Nazi every day. People have been doing this for years, as if there's not some shift when you're saying people misapplied a label to you, and then you go out and, fluff a neo-Nazi on your show. Like, it's a weird kind of attempt at total insulation from any consequences of your actions, which is another part of free speech. So we try to critique those things to have people have a formation of the right, and then also realize not everything you hear online is gospel truth, even if you agree with people on other aspects.
Well, and that's where, and right now what we're seeing is this like fear of white nationalism, of white national Christian men coming into power, and like because we are seeing people literally put neo-Nazis on their show and think that's okay. And I know those are like one-off examples in a very large spectrum of people, and not everybody has those beliefs, but that's and then that gets pointed to by the left. And then there's this fear mongering back and forth happening that if you are aligning with anything within the Christian religion, then that's what you're advocating for. And that's not accurate at all. But um, there are, I'm seeing scary things. Like I was watching the Christian Zionists versus anti-Zionists debates.
Oh yeah, some of our
Yeah,
students were on that, actually, two of them.
and they were amazing, but then I went on some of the Instagrams of the anti-Zionists, the Christian anti-Zionists, and, like, what I saw there was absolutely terrifying. Like, to use scripture in a way to talk about how, Bibi is pretty much a demon, and this unholy war is gonna bring, like, the end of times and things, and, like, people are resonating and following that, so, as somebody sitting over here watching that happening, it's terrifying for us.
And it is it is for us too. And again, it's another example where I point out to people that are in the middle. Um, is it possible to have valid critiques of Israel that aren't anti-Semitic, or questions about some aspect of Jewish life? That's possible. But again, the people that are your like champions or crusaders against, whatever they want to call globalist Jewish elite, or Israel, just look at the rest of what they say. Even if you have a question about some critique they did, they always descend into these other insane things, either vilifying, evil, horrific, just nonsensical things about Jews, and also too about other things. Like, they're also the crowd questioning the moon landing and obsessed about the JFK files. And I know Epstein's become a football that both the radical right and left are using to try to attack Trump or say things are a distraction. But all these things inevitably descend that way. And particularly, I think, for anybody that claims to be a Christian, like, one of the most horrific things you can do is to distort scripture to justify hatred or evil. That's one of these verses. I'll just paraphrase, but it says something like, better to have a millstone tied around your neck and be thrown into the ocean than that any one of you teachers should lead one of my little ones astray. It's a quote where Jesus was talking to, some corrupt officials, and saying, like, basically, you have quite a duty given your position, your influence, your teaching, and you'll be held accountable for that. And we see that just going crazy in a lot of ways. Yeah, go ahead.
Here's the problem though is, again, we're talking about, the younger generation. Everything is in these short 90-second clips, right? That's the attention span. People are further removed from history, and the algorithms are targeting same content. So it's that content being refed over and over and over. So you watch this 90-second clip, and there's a beautiful young girl, and she's intelligent, and she's well-spoken, and she's quoting scripture, and she's referencing history. And I would have to spend hours educating myself on the exact things in scripture she's referring to, and the exact times in history she's referring to even begin to understand if the things she said were realistic or not. And I feel like people are not taking that time. So they're just going to take whatever she said because she sounded like she knew what she was talking about. And it's going to take me too long to actually process and unpack that. So I'm just going to take that to be truth. And how do we combat that?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think the one tangible things we're trying to do that with our work now, in particular with Generation Zion. Um, we have some educational courses we put out. We do social media where we'll do responses. But the key thing too is if we can get people for like at least a day. So we've done this now at a few conferences at America Fest with TPUSA and CPAC. We'll fly out these student leaders a day or two before the actual conference, and we do our own huddle and discussion of, exhaustive education, not exhaustive, but as much as you can do in a day and a half about Zionism on the historical end, the political end, the scriptural lens, all of those kind of different things. And I think particularly with scripture too, that there's all of these distortions and debates about end times theology or revelations or all those things. And I never personally, and I don't think it's very successful to tie, Zionism to any one take on scripture. I think the thing that you have to believe if you're a Jew or a Christian is that, there's something special about the Jewish people. God wanted to work with them in history, not because they're uniquely virtuous or perfect, but because they were a messenger appointed and given a duty. Um, and if you're a Christian, then going from the offshoot of that Jewish root, you have to believe there's still a role and significance. What exactly that looks like is up for debate. But to go and then take scripture to justify some kind of Jewish hatred or something else is evil and also just ahistorical. But you're right, for the average person, like it takes a while to go through these things. So the best thing is when we can get people together to sort through that inaccurate stuff and go for the truth. In the wider culture and debate, I think there's tactics that can use to help. I think some of the key things is to try to ask early on in questioning where someone's anti-Zionism or Semitism is kind of stemming from. So when we have these debates, and we've had Groypers and other people come up to it at these conferences, they'll often just kind of rapid fire a bunch of crazy stuff, like maybe everything from Protocols of the Elders of Zion to USS Liberty to passage from the Talmud they don't like, and just go exhaustive. And you have to sort through each thing, but I always kind of force them to go back to the zoom out question. Okay, so what is your main issue? Is your main issue with like a Jewish state, Israel? And if that's the case, is it about intrinsically the way that state operates? Or is it, if you're an American, about the relationship and you see that as corrupt? So there's different possibilities. You could see Israel as a good country or a bad country. And then there's a question of, is our alliance a good alliance or a bad alliance? And obviously we work them up to say it's a good country, ethical, worth supporting. And also it's a favorable alliance. So I always try to force people to be consistent, because some people I would come to would just end on the point of, I don't want any foreign aid, I don't want foreign entanglements, kind of misquoting George Washington, to be honest. So we go back in our courses on the history of the founding fathers, again, about the Jewish tradition, but also even about alliances and military support, because it's ahistorical to say problems with Muslims started after we got involved with Israel. Our very first war, as you guys know, was with the Barbary pirates in the late 17 and early 1800s. We created our navy for that. We went, invaded a foreign country, flew a foreign flag, occupied them until they relented and gave back slaves that they had stolen, and consented to peace. So that is our narrative. That's our tradition, both as Christians and as Americans. So again, if people want to come along and rewrite a new path forward, rejecting all of that, in my mind, that's a little bit more of an intellectually honest approach. And commentators like Fuentes and others, who I think are some of the most toxic, will try to have it both ways. They have this kind of obsession with the 1930s and cosplaying. And the remarkable thing about Nick is he manages to both bootlick communists and Nazis, which is hard to do since they hated each other and were enemies. But not because one was right. It's like, two warring gangs that are both evil. And he manages to kind of support both of that. And I think implicitly what he wants and some of these other people is a more European, post-Christian, fascist kind of movement, because both of those rejected God. Hitler would sometimes give lip service, but it's well documented now in books like Hitler's Table Talks.
Um, we were discussing how Hitler literally replaced the Bible and somehow, I mean, there was pushback, but this was, like, accepted, and the I don't even know where to go from there, but you could talk about that more in the
Mhm. Yeah, yeah, it's very well documented. A book called Hitler's Table Talks by the historian Hugh Trevor Roper. He also goes through this in depth. Hitler thought the God of the Jews and Christians was weak, effeminate. This whole idea of sacrifice or love was just not the masculine, toxic masculine kind of virtues, going back to the Norse pantheon and all these various things. So he wanted to create a new religion, but occasionally would use, references to try to soften it to the public. But anyway, our point is there's nothing Christian, conservative, America loving about any of these strains of skepticism of the Jews, of Israel, all these things. And moreover, the traditions directly contradict that the people come from, whether it be the proper ethics of Christianity, which many churches have made statements on that, especially in the 20th century, about rejecting anti-Semitism, or about our history. So if people want to come create this new neo-pagan will to power project, they can try to make that happen, but they have to. I think a big part of what we're trying to clarify specifically on the right is to make them own that it's a new thing. They don't get to take on a mantle of America first, whatever kind of thing they want to adopt, because they do just have a new, innovation. They want to try to bring about an evil innovation. So in our education, I try to go at both of those elements. There's the surface level questions people throw out about aid or whatever those are, but I always cut it down and go back to that root to make people be intellectually honest that they can't piggyback off our tradition with this new kind of anti-Semitic model they want to take.
So, do you have any advice for the young student who might, this all crystallizes intellectually for them? They understand it, but they're in an environment that it's just such a conformist kind of environment, especially the younger that you are, and there is all this propaganda going on, and that individual might feel like if he does say something, then he's vulnerable to getting attacks. I mean, is there any advice that you can give for a young Christian student to, and I think of the Catholics, there's a lot of division there with Zionism as well. And you hear the Pope say something and then you go to church and you feel a different way. I mean, really, how can we make sense for this for the young student who is an ally, who is intelligent, but feels that social pressure?
Yeah. Yeah. With the Christian aspect, I think, education is really the only anecdote. And we provide that at GenZ, and people can go to genzion.org. You guys do a lot of great resources in education. But at the simpler level, I think it's not getting caught up in those specifics of questions or critiques. That's important and needs to be addressed, but about like the worldviews of where the anti-Israel commentators are coming from. And also to apply some healthy skepticism to the anti-Israel side, the anti-Semitic side. Especially if people want to want to act like they're revolutionaries on the left or like nonconformists on the right. They have to accept the fact that if they're attacking Israel, they're siding with the mainstream media, global institutions, the UN Human Rights Council, which is dozens and dozens of resolutions against Israel while ignoring, Rwanda, whatever kind of actual atrocity you want to look at. So if people want to side with the real globalists, if they have that right wing kind of perspective, that's totally in line with it. And then this weird confluence now where you see ask questions like how much actual difference in foreign policy or take on the Jews and Israel would there be between Tucker Carlson and Zoran Mandami? I think or the Squad, Rashida Tlaib. I think there's barely any daylight there about who they see as the villains, who's pulling the puppet strings, who's controlling our foreign policy, who's doing this or that. So again, like this weird hybrid, you know, thing that's only unified by anti-Israel stuff, but also anti-American things, because it reduces the agency of the president of our country, makes us subject to these shadowy forces. So it's an inherently negative, depressing kind of prescription, and also happens to not be true. So I would have people, not get caught up in all the details, but educate themselves as they can, while also recognizing like it's a poisoned root that all of these attacks are coming from. And, we could think of them as weeds. They still have to be trimmed and cut down, but eventually this root has to be rejected. And I think on the other side, you have the healthy, beautiful root of the Judeo-Christian civilization that developed into Western civilization and gave us our freedoms, our rights, all these things. And particularly too for the traditional Catholics or others that are now talking a lot about, are we a Christian nation, Christian nationalism, all those other things. I think it could become a complicated debate, but I always try to go back to the idea of, I think it's valid to say we're a Christian nation in the sense that the founding fathers would have seen that, meaning majority of the population there was Christian of some form. And some of these freedoms and aspects, like the right to conscience, are baked into our country, and it's necessary for both Jews and Christians. We don't believe you can coerce faith. It has to be a free choice. Therefore, the state cannot impose that upon people. And again, we have the founding fathers, George Washington writing to the congregation, I believe, in Providence, Rhode Island. And then I think it was John Adams writing to the congregation in Savannah, Georgia. At the time, these two synagogues asking about, what is their place in America? And both times the founders saying, you are completely integrated into this, like without your root and tradition and your revelation from God, we wouldn't be here. So that's the real kind of truth. So it's about, addressing the surface when it needs to be, but really having people understand the roots. And then also from that, they can choose, is this really the side you want to go on, this kind of new movement? And I think most, legitimate Christians I meet, when they're confronted with that, can kind of see the right side.
I want to talk a bit more about Gen Zion. And, I think you have been so successful. As we mentioned, I saw some of your students in the Christian anti-Zionist versus Christian Zionist debate, and the content they're putting out, the quality of content and how smart it is and how on trend and how much it actually blasts through the algorithms that we're fighting against and how successful they are with that. And how did you get to a point where you knew that was important to do? Your students were in a place where they were able to do that, and that strategized and went about it so smartly.
Yeah. It's a good question. I think it's good recruitment and good programming. So hopefully we can have some credit for both of those. But there's always going to be the small percentage of students in college and even young professionals that are going to be passionate about, let's say, political ideas. And this is an interesting hybrid because it's kind of political and cultural. But you find those students that have that interest. And so, we recruited on campuses, put out a lot of things through word of mouth. In my background, I was involved in a lot of Christian fellowship programs that do education, and going to those pipelines to find people and then just giving them that immersive experience of um, online. We had about 25 hours of lectures and content from scholars that our students had to go through before they applied for the Young Leadership Program I ran, and then another 10 weeks of education, and then a trip to Israel. So it's like the book stuff and then the reality. And we go to the West Bank. We hear from Palestinians too, to kind of give that full picture. And obviously, not everyone has the time or bandwidth to do all of that track. But that's why also at the grassroots level, with our work with the Fearless Action League in the past and now Gen Zion, we do have a network of thousands of people across the country that are just mostly Christians of goodwill who are on call when there's an act of anti-Semitism or other things that happen. And so the positive thing on that is, this is still a majority of people are with us. A majority of people, I think, in the U.S. are still more sympathetic to Israel than, I don't like the juxtaposition Israel versus Palestine, because to actually care about the Palestinian people is to support Israel. We know that because
100%. 100%. And I think people don't understand that.
yeah, so it's a false dichotomy, but even at that surface level, given that bad polling question, that kind of leads the witness essentially, more people still side with that. And even too, at these conferences we're seeing at America Fest and at CPAC, they did polls after and found still majority support for Israel and this alliance. And so even for people that can't go all the way through our programs or education, uh, there is this large well of support for Israel and the Jewish people that still exists among Christians. And Christians still being the majority of America, I think there's still a lot of hope. And I think it's part of the thing that has made us not slide as far as Europe has, both being, in Christendom in some definition, has been the fact that our religiosity has stayed higher. And that's a good thing, because I think if somebody spends time once a week in the Bible, and the churches I grew up in, like almost equally amounts in the Old Testament and the New, um, it's hard to get some of those bad ideas kind of inculcated. I will say one kind of risk factor which we're confronting now is, um, there's a higher percentage of religiosity among Gen Z, particularly Gen Z men, and that's a good thing, and even more favoring the kind of high church, Catholic Orthodox traditions. And so I think that's not a bad thing intrinsically, but some of these people coming along and then having false teachers that try to take that tradition and say, oh yeah, to be really Catholic means like you kind of understand or excuse aspects of like pogroms in Christian Europe or discrimination of that type. And typically they don't go that far to say it, but they're kind of just like unconcerned with anti-Semitism generally. I think it's overblown or not that representative. So we are trying to work with the good trend of people caring about spirituality and then these ideas, but then maybe going into specific churches or hearing. I think it's much less the actual churches, like things in the pulpits. It's more commentators using like a team jersey. I think the best example of this was this. I'll try to be charitable. Difficult to listen to woman, Carrie Prejean, whose claim to fame was being a beauty pageant model, and then kind of riding coattails of one conservative statement she said. That's all fine, but then she became Catholic last year, and now we saw had this intentional operation to go into the Religious Liberty Commission, uh, which is a kind of ceremonial board appointed by the president, and infiltrate it and turn everything to be anti-Israel, anti-Zionist, and anti-Semitic. And she kept saying, I believe in her statement, she said like, "And I'm Catholic as a Catholic," like 5 or 6 times, uh, to a way that you can kind of see there's nothing in line with actual Christ-like spirit or charity or anything about what she was saying. And she kept using that team jersey, trying to signal to other people that are Catholic and maybe don't hold her views yet. And then she took the narrative and flipped it and said, I was persecuted because I was Catholic, not because I hijacked the whole proceedings, went after Jews, Jewish influence, the Gaza war, when the whole context was about religious freedom in the United States. Um, so there's examples like that. I think those are really the bad actors. And so what we try to do with church communities is get them to be more vocal, either in the support or at the very least, like calling out that. And I'll say to the credit of Catholics in the wake of that, both Cardinal Dolan and Bishop Barron, who are on the commission as well, put out statements saying they don't agree with her. She's not speaking for Catholics. Um, Sorry, this is long, but one brief addendum there. A confusion that the anti-Israel side that is claiming to be Christian often tries to use is they'll fixate on one scriptural interpretation, specifically this doctrine called dispensationalism, which is kind of obscure belief about what Revelations means, the last book of the Bible, which talks about the end times, what it means, what prophecies will happen. And there's a strain of Protestantism that has very distinct beliefs about that. It's not what I hold to personally, and my view on Revelations has always been too. It's poetic and apocalyptic literature. Like, and that's not a knock on it because Scripture, both the Old and New Testament, is a mix of history, of poetry, um, apocalyptic literature, and prophetic texts. So the Bible itself doesn't all claim to be literally true because it's people writing. Sometimes people use metaphors, all of those things. So the complex task of theology is looking at all of that. But these anti-Israel or anti-Semitic Christians will take that one strain and say, we don't agree with that strain. And the Catholic Church officially says, they don't believe in dispensationalism. So she took that to say, yeah, if you're a Zionist and a Christian, you must believe this specific view of some Christian Zionists, and Catholics don't agree with that. Therefore, you cannot be a Zionist and be Catholic. And, this is a, op to try to take over Catholics, which is just utterly a distortion. And the vast majority of Christians in the US don't build their belief that Jews have the right to a sovereign homeland on the basis of just one theology. Um, so we try to go at all of those various elements to show, because the frustrating aspect is it'd be one thing if somebody put out a good faith, logical case arguing against us, but to use all of these manipulations and tactics and victim blaming and or victim mentality and surreptitious strategies is, I think, shows where their heart is at. It shows that it's not an honest project. It's not organic. It's not honest questions, but they're talking to millions of Christians who don't know about this issue and do have honest questions. So I always try to confront people where they're at to say, it's okay if you want to ask, what about this thing Candace or Tucker said, like in good faith, because they often just don't know. And so we serve as a resource to take that bad idea and then present the truth.
I'm glad to hear that from what you're seeing that there still is more support for Israel, because a lot of the numbers we see don't reflect that. I was talking to some of the professors at Moody Bible School, for example, and for the first time, they're actually seeing that their student population is less than 50% in support of Israel, where historically, so those numbers have been concerning, and I think as we talked about with social media and these, we had Pastor Corey Brooks on recently, and he talked about like Instagram fake pastors who come in and preach, and they're actually not studied and they're not grounded and they're just spewing BS, but they again seem legitimate. So people of the faith are coming to their channels and listening. And like, are people listening to these people online, or are they actually like in the church listening to their pastors and priests and like, I think there's different messaging between whether they're actually coming in person and being present versus what they're receiving online.
Yeah, it's such a good point. It's almost never coming from the actual pulpit. Sometimes it is. I'm trying to pull up now. There's an article my team shared yesterday. Uh, this is from Washington Times. So the headline is "Wrong, Tucker Evangelicals Have Not Turned Against Israel." And one specific snippet in there is the deeper the Christian commitment and support by people in polling, the more likely they are to support Israel. And they measure that in a few different ways. Like, you could say you're a Christian, and then they ask, how often do you go to church? If it's once a month, that's one thing. If it's once a week, do you tithe to your church? And the more you go down in the level of faithfulness, which is the best metric of actual engagement, how much the idea matters to you, the more pro-Israel they are, the more traditionally support they have. It is definitely true that it's slipping and it's been decreasing, and the most at-risk cohort is young people. So college polls, even at a Christian school like Moody, it doesn't surprise me you would see that and maybe be underwater. If you take all age demographics of Christians, it's a better picture. But we definitely have to confront that vanguard, because if people, if in my generation, it was more so evangelicals becoming kind of apathetic, or maybe going like social justice ways, or just fading away from any faith at all, which is a different problem, because maybe they would stop thinking about the connection between Christians and Jews just because they don't think about God or providential history or anything. But it's a worse problem now if you have people, or I'd say a negative side effect of the good trend of more religiosity among Gen Z is, if they encounter those people that are taking the mantle of Christianity and hearing distortions, can they can like marry a religious fervor with a passion about these ideas, and to think, yeah, I'm like a really committed Catholic, so I don't like that this woman was persecuted for being a Catholic, questioning Israel on the Religious Liberty Commission. So we have to refute those ideas, for sure, to show that it's just not a legitimate tie. But
It's like homicidal empathy. You know how people say suicidal? It's like, um, because they're trying, again, like what we were saying is you can do evil thinking you're righteous, you know? So, I would like to understand what you have moving forward in the future. Are you guys, what are you optimistic and excited about that you guys are working on right now? Is there anything in the works?
yeah, so we're doing a few things. Planning some large scale trips to take about 1,500 students over the course of this year to Israel. It's obviously dicey now with flights and who can get there, but we definitely want to re-up that and continue to do that on the ground training. Also, we're going around the circuit of political conferences and doing these trainings before that. So we'll have two things coming up in August. We'll be involved with the Israel on Campus Coalition Conference, and then also the Young Americans for Freedom Conference. And we'll have the links for applications coming out soon, which I can send to you guys. But people will basically be able to apply for um, subsidized or a free ticket and lodging if they're, typically we'll do like under 30. Sometimes there's some exceptions to come to these conferences and get that education. We also are continuing to put out podcasts and content and education. That's a lot of the public facing. I'll say another project that I'm involved with as managing director is something called the Conference of Christian Presidents for Israel. And it's closely affiliated with the National Task Force to Combat Antisemitism. Uh, and those efforts are, one, on the Christian side with the conference. It's taking heads of colleges, conservative organizations, Christian groups, and coming together with a combined voice on certain confusions or issues that we're seeing. And we'll put out collective talking points or statements about how we think Christians should approach this issue. And then the task force, of course, is made up of Christians, Jews, people of other faiths, and is working to combat anti-Semitism at different levels. So those things are happening with some public-facing events. There'll be an event in DC on May 18th with the task force. Uh, but also there's a lot, I just think there's a lot positive happening behind the scenes with our work in DC and elsewhere about um, the administration, members of Congress, and others who are working to craft policy that will be helpful in this vein. So I'd say that to encourage people that those things may not hit the headlines for a while, but there are good trends on that.
Well, we are so grateful to you. I'm so honored to know you, and for your work. It's so needed at this time. And, again, how we started this podcast, you guys showed up for us at a time where we felt so alone and abandoned and isolated. And that impact will resonate with me for the rest of my life, your actions. So I really, really thank you.
It's my pleasure. Yeah, it's been some of the most meaningful things I've got to be involved in my life, and ties a lot of those things from my family and hearing stories from my grandmother, and also just these values. So yeah, I definitely am honored to be a part of it, and for me, it always feels like a gift too. People, not everybody gets the chance to work in something that also they're passionate about and can find meaning in. So it's been a blessing to get to know you and others in the Jewish community, and excited to continue this work.
Thank you so much for being on Jew and Stew. It's so reciprocal, Isaac. Thanks so much.
Well, that was Isaac Woodward from the Generational Zion team, bringing a strong Christian voice for standing with Israel and showing up against anti-Semitism. Thanks so much for joining us today, Isaac. Thank you so much for your work mobilizing young Christians. Thank you so much for marching with the Chicago Jewish Alliance during the DNC while holding those powerful images. And we just want to thank you so much for your commitment and for going way beyond what the average person does. We cannot thank you enough. Thanks for listening to the podcast Jew and Stew. If you enjoyed the conversation, subscribe, leave a review, and share it with a friend. Until next time, stay bold, stay strong, and keep showing up. Follow the Chicago Jewish Alliance to stay in the loop, and subscribe to this podcast so you can see what's coming next. We're going to have speakers that represent the entire spectrum of the Jewish community, from philosophical thinkers, from soldiers, people on the front lines of advocacy work on universities. Thank you for being here. We'll see you next time.